I'm going to do the introductory slides and then hand over to Steve Nichols, my colleague from the NBI, who will take you through the results of the work. But where I wanted to start was to explain a bit about why this work has been done and who's involved in it. So Steve, if you can drive the slides. What we did as the NBI is to work with Business Unity South Africa and the Boston Consulting Group in order to do this work. And when we started, what we had realized is that the kinds of pressures on business, not only in South Africa, but internationally, that were explained by the CEOs who spoke earlier on this morning, were becoming sharper and sharper, and that companies in South Africa were starting to say, what would it take for them to transition, both in terms of energy as well as in terms of operations? How were they going to ensure that in that transition that their worker issues were addressed in line with the conversations that we've had about the just transition? What might it mean? What were the risks and what were the opportunities? And so we decided in consultation with our company members to do a piece of work that would ask the question about whether it would be possible for different industry sectors in South Africa to be able to reach net zero by 2050. So putting up a hypothetical question and then saying, let us look at if we could find those pathways. And the reason for doing that was that our sense is that if we're going to progress as a country, and if business is going to take advantage of and build the opportunity space, then we need to get quite practical, and we need to have a plan that tells us where we are going to go as business. And that plan, we were hoping, could feed into a broader national plan. And I'm certainly hoping that one of the outputs of this commission in time will be that national plan. So this is a business contribution into it. But it also emerges from the realization that if we as a country want to be able to mobilize the green investment finance that is available internationally, we also need to go out into the international and I suppose the national finance community with that plan. And we need to be quite practical about it. And we looked at the kind of work that has been done in different countries around the world, including the kind of plan that Morocco as an African country has put forward, and that has enabled them to mobilize significant amounts of climate finance. Countries like Germany, countries like the UK, all have these business plans that then enable us to say, if we're going to transition particular sectors and the private sector in general, this is what it's going to take. So that's the background to the piece of work that we're doing. In order to do this, we've worked with a very wide range of stakeholders, both from the private sector, from academia, from government, from civil society, from the labor movement. So we've tried to be as consultative, tried to take a consultative approach. There's a whole governance structure for the work that has been designed in order to ensure that that consultation can take place. And we've been able, I think, importantly, to build on two things in order to do the work. The first is the depth of experience in the business sector itself. So we've workshopped. A lot of the results of this work have been workshopped with industry experts and with specialists coming from companies and coming from industry associations. But we've also then been able to draw on external expertise. And in working with BCG as a global consultancy, one of the important things that we've been able to do is to also bring in an international experience and to bring in experts who are working with similar issues right across the world in different industry sectors. So we've developed a body of work essentially, and I think one of the important things in doing this presentation for the Commission today is to say that this body of work does exist. It has depths. There is significant information available, and we would be very happy to put that at the disposal of the Commission for the Commission to critically engage with it and decide what there is that would be useful as the program of the Commission develops going forward. Okay, so in terms of net zero, I don't think that to this audience I need to explain why it is important to have a net zero global goal for the planet in order by 2050 in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. We've talked about the IPCC's special report of 2018 that looked at the 1.5 degrees C level. We looked at the degree to which emissions would need to fall globally, and the huge ask of all of us in order to be able to contribute our fair share to that. So I think that's the first issue that informed the work. The second is really where South Africa sits in the world, and what the slide talks to is the fact that there is significant numbers of countries that are coming forward internationally to make their net zero commitments. And as we move towards COP26, we believe that more and more countries are going to come forward and be able to say whether they're going to achieve net zero before 2050, by 2050, post 2050. And I think ourselves and India's haven't made a net zero commitment yet, but our low emission development strategy sets it out as an aspirational goal. And we believe that the work of the Commission may well assist government and assist the country in this regard. We are also, I think, of the view that making some kind of a commitment in relation to when and how a country reaches net zero and what needs to be in place for that to happen is going to be ultimately, in reality, if not set out, is going to be one of the underpinnings that is going to determine who and how climate finance is going to actually be able to be mobilized. Okay. In addition, and I think a number of the CEOs who spoke earlier referred to this, we are operating in an environment where increasing numbers of our trade partners, key trade partners of ours, are talking around carbon border adjustments and border taxes. We don't agree, we don't necessarily support, I think it is a reality. It's something that is being talked about more and more. I see that the US, having come back into the fold of climate nations internationally, is also starting to talk about border tax adjustments. And there are huge issues for South Africa around our competitiveness as a country. And in the next slide, we'll go on to them. So we're looking at the risks to us, and there is significant risks. We are a country whose trade vulnerability is particularly acute. And our commodity trade balance is very vulnerable to transition risk. And this slide shows what our key exports are. And in the degree of embedded carbon, their value, and the degree of embedded carbon in all of these key export commodities is significant. And in some cases, the risks of climate impacts, as in the case of the citrus fruit industry, are significant and huge. And so we risk ending up as a country exporting products that, as the world's energy transition moves on and as the world decarbonizes, become particularly vulnerable to those commodities no longer being used, or us being punished, or punitive measures being put in place in relation to all of those, in relation to those goods. And so we need to be able to develop a plan that ensures, and I think Minister Patel spoke about this at length, spoke about the new products for a new future. Next slide, Steve. Okay, I think the next thing that we identified is that what we do at the moment is critical. We're looking in the long term. We were looking at a 2050 target for the work that we did, but we recognize that what we do now is going to significantly impact our potential to get there. So We need to avoid infrastructure lock-in that will hinder long-term competitiveness. We need to recognize the global shift in commodity value pools, play to our strengths, invest in the skills and technologies of the future, and drive, not be on the receiving end, but also drive international exchange of expertise and technology. And then we need to aggressively pursue green sources of funds and preferential trade agreements that would finance a just transition. And all of that is in our ability to start immediately. So in the work that we've done, what we've looked at is what is the cost of inaction for South Africa. So if we don't respond to the critical global economic drivers and the signals that global climate action is showing, what would that cost us? Then secondly, what would it take for us to get to net zero emissions? And we wanted to come up with practical solutions, identify the barriers we'd need to overcome, and then be able to say what are the investments and financing that would be needed, and what would be the socio and economic implications for South Africa to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in there, a big part of that work is the work around the just transition in terms of looking at the futures of both workers and communities. What we weren't trying to do was to set any targets, and nor were we trying to set a particular ambition for which level of national emission reductions we should reach and by when. And so it's not a prescriptive study in that sense. Next slide. Okay, I spoke about our governance structure of this. We have a CEO champions group. I'll show you a set of slides. We have an advisory board that has industry, government, civil society and labor representatives. And then we have a steering committee for the work of key companies that are involved in the work. What we have done in terms of the work that we've done is to really do work initially around green stimulus, then to do a lot of work around energy related emissions, work around process related emissions. We currently are doing work around in the agriculture, land use, agriculture, forestry and land use sectors. We're going to be moving on to do work around transport emissions, and are also looking at adaptation and resilience. So those are the kind of technical areas of the work that we've done. And what we wanted to do was to be inclusive and to be able to create a platform for collaboration so that our work was well informed by expertise, ensure a balanced final outcome, and then a fact-based business report that could go be provided to government and be of use to the country as a whole. Okay, then just to say, we've put up on the slide, we've managed to mobilize, I think, a significant grouping of CEOs. It grows all the time. They come from a very wide range of sectors, not only the high emitting sectors, but also sectors that are impacted by climate change. So the forestry sector, the finance sector is represented, the retail sector is part of it, as well as significant players in the agro-processing sector. And then there are obviously the CEOs from the heavy emitting industries. And together we've worked with those CEOs to come up with what we think is the basis of a business-led plan. And we'd like to put that forward to the Commission now. So I'm going to now hand over to Steve Nichols to take you through the rest of the presentation.
So greetings, everyone. Just to highlight some of the magic in the study is our attempt to be inclusive. So we've had 9 technical workshops working with specialists from a range of backgrounds, typically industry and company experts, but we've also had labor, civil society and academia attending. We've had 4 advisory board meetings, we've had 5 steering committee meetings and 2 CEO events. So a lot of engagement in the background, there's a lot of additional one-on-one engagement with key stakeholders. So we don't have a lot of time, but just to kind of make the point that we probably have 300 slides of actual evidence, trying to summarize it into 5 or 6 slides here. So we'll go quite fast. But to give you a sense of the way we've done this in our analysis of the electricity sector, we've built a Plexos model. That's the same software that Eskom uses. It's an industry standard around the world. We spent a lot of time with Eskom's modeling team, understanding their inputs and assumptions. We spent a lot of time with the CSR and UCT and other groups to try to make sure that the outputs of our models are aligning with theirs and that we have a similar perspective. And what we did was we used that model to assess 3 archetypes of energy. We talk about a renewables dominant system, a coal dominant system, and a nuclear dominant system. And then we subjected that model to sensitivities based on what the experts in our expert group said. And as a result of that, even if you take the worst case assumptions for renewables and the best case assumptions for coal and for nuclear, the renewables system works out cheaper, lowest emissions, and has the least sensitivity to those input variables. And we take that as a proxy for risk. So our renewables dominant system is cheapest, least emissions, and least risk. And therefore is a system that you would choose as your vehicle to get us to net zero. And how you would get to net zero is you would build renewables and gas for peaking support to manage intermittency, which would get you to about 80 to 85 megatons of CO2 emissions per year. And then to get that down to 12, you would overbuild renewables to create some redundancy in the system. And to get that down to 0, you would need a combination of gas and direct air capture, which we should caution isn't a commercially available technology at the moment, or hydrogen. And hydrogen is something that's really attractive to us because of what many of the previous speakers have mentioned. It provides us an opportunity to export into other markets as well as to create low carbon industry here in South Africa. And we went on then to look at the range of ways you could implement that energy system, looking at what we call bookend scenarios, letting the model optimize for emissions, and then it would close coal by 2042, and then having the other end of the spectrum, having the model aligned with the IRP. And I guess what's key from the outputs there is a high-level summary. We can decommission coal according to the dead stop dates prior to 2030. We need to investigate accelerated decommissioning of coal post that date. Huge ramp up of renewables. I mean, the energy mix at the end is a combination of renewables, battery storage, and hydrogen. And so we would need some investment in peaking gas in the interim, but a lot of investment in batteries and battery storage in order to enable that last mile technologies. And obviously, we have to be paying attention to those just transitions. But the top line finding is no need for further coal in the system. There is some need for gas to support peaking and huge investments in renewables. And with that comes huge investments required to expand and upgrade the grid, which Mandy mentioned earlier. So then shifting to petrochemicals as part of that energy hub, depending on the assumptions we make, and we still need to refine some of these assumptions as we explore the transport sector, but conventional refineries can be phased out towards the end of 2030. And we need to start investing in green assets that Sasol mentioned earlier as well, thinking about biomass and hydrogen as input costs, which could potentially position South Africa as an exporter of carbon neutral fuels and jet fuels in particular. I guess the greatest uncertainty, which we've highlighted in these red blocks, is the assumptions that we make around the role of biomass and green hydrogen in the conversion of synfuel assets, and the role of potentially things like direct air capture. So while we have a clear set of technology pathways to transition both electrical energy and petrochemicals, there are some uncertainties that require more interrogation and would certainly be a good topic for the commissioners. On the gas side, we also have to start thinking about that. There's some concerns from stakeholders about once we build the gas infrastructure that we may use it for applications that aren't beneficial to climate, and so that's a key factor. But there is this demand for gas, and how we supply the gas is important. So there's two potential demands for gas that are created. One is the gas to support peaking in electricity, and other is gas to transition industry, be it synfuels or conventional industries, where you make a net climate gain from that fuel switch. The key issue, of course, in South Africa, though, is how you supply that gas, and we need to be able to supply that gas within specific affordability ranges. And so the technology pathways and the sources of gas are important, and really there are four potential options. The Rovuma, a pipeline from northern Mozambique to South Africa, is one of the major supply options that would create value in Gauteng, would allow us to convert synfuels assets, but also concentrate the conversion of Eskom-fired coal-fired power stations. Whereas if we were to make Brulpadda and Laypad work, which are gas fields off the Southern Cape, that would enable a revival of the PetroSA, conversion of OCGTs in that area. And so that kind of unlocks coastal value creation. If both work, well, then you unlock coastal and inland value creation. And if none of them work, then you have LNG options. And LNG then would probably land in places like Richards Bay and be piped into Gauteng for demand. Affordability is a key issue there, particularly in converting synfuels. So a lot of work we still need to do around the affordability of gas, but a key conversation, as well as attaching to that what the other environmental and health impacts of gas might be over time. But this is just really a sort of highlight of the potential pathways for those three sectors. We also have pathways for mining and for agriculture, forestry, and land use, which has also come up in previous conversations. And we plan to add other sectors as we go through the year. Key to this are, as Joanne mentioned, are assets that we're happy to share with the Commissioner. We have this Eskom model, electricity model that allows us to interrogate some of the assumptions. We've also built a social accounting matrix for South Africa that allows more enhanced economic modeling, as well as building future scenario social accounting matrices that allow us to assess how an economy might change over time. So these models are available. Obviously, they're sensitive to input assumptions, and the diversity on the commissioners helps us sort of refine those assumptions and potentially as a way of getting some consensus. Of course, these are technical pathways, and we approach them sort of very academically to say what technologies would we use, what kind of policy support would we need, and what kind of international financial support, but never losing sight of the key topic of today, which has been a just transition and the role of people being the center. And what we noted in our electricity work in particular is there is a potential for creating huge amounts of jobs, both through the construction and maintenance of electricity infrastructure, but also in the localization of support industries to those sectors. So it is possible, and we think likely, that the net impact on South Africa will be positive, both from an economic and a jobs creation perspective. But we should not lose sight that the impacts, the negative impacts are local. They're local to geography and they're local to sector. In the case of coal, and that's happening in Mpumalanga. And we can't also lose sight that we talk about the just energy transition, but that really is the sort of coal face, so to speak, of transitions, because we're going to see similar kinds of transitions in vehicle manufacture, in heavy industry, in petroleum fuels, and so on. And so there is an opportunity for us to learn as we transition in the energy sector and apply those learnings to other sectors. And so we've started to consider the dimensions of a just transition. So the narrow definition of a just transition would be to think just about jobs and skills. But actually, there's a broader opportunity here that we need to think about as a country, is how do we use this transition that is largely exogenous, as something driven by international trade and pressure, to also deal with some of the pressing socioeconomic impacts of our times. And so thinking a bit more broadly than jobs and skills, the other components that we would have to deal with when we think about a just transition is social welfare, geographic and cultural dislocation, so that resulted on movement of communities. Inclusion's been mentioned several times in South Africa, particularly the inclusion of marginalized groups like Black women. Ownership is a key issue. How do we transfer capital in this process and therefore drive better equality, capital being a big driver of earnings? And then quality of work, obviously very important, and then service delivery. So in many of these transition locations, the local companies are contributing to service delivery to people. And the classic example is mines running wastewater treatment plants and waste management plants. And so as those companies transition out of the area, what do you replace it with, and how do you also then prop up service delivery for local people? So these are the things that we've focused on. There are a bunch of other things that need to be taken into consideration, like education and sort of broader environmental awareness beyond climate change impacts. So we think about those dimensions as key enablers. And so the work that we are beginning and are having some difficulty gathering the data for, but are making some good progress, is if you think about the labor force of today, it has a particular characteristic of permanent, highly skilled and high income people with certain levels of unemployment. And we want to use these key enablers, how we think about ownership, how we think about social welfare, for example, to create a labor force of the future that has more permanent, highly skilled, high-income people and fewer unemployed people. And so that requires thinking quite specifically about these skills disaggregated jobs. So for example, if you want to transition a rock miner who's a relatively highly skilled, highly paid person in the mining sector, and they would need to be retrained as an electrician or a carpenter or a fitter and turner to earn similar levels of security in a different economy. And so that gives us good guidance on how we structure our skills and our retraining programs. And we might use those reskilling programs in combination with, for example, early retirement of those workers that are older. But critical to all of this is creating investment in those areas. And so to Minister Patel's earlier comments, and that's an area that we really need to focus on and understand is what do we invest in and what kind of skills and jobs are needed, and how do we reverse engineer our investment and reskilling programs to suit that. And when we do that, what it enables us to do is have a much clearer message around international support. What kind of access to preferential finance do we need? What kind of skills development do we need? And what kind of trade cooperation do we need? And being more accurate means that we can sit with those parties and ask for specific things, which is a much more constructive conversation. So the key question, I think, from our perspective is what is our ambition for a just transition? Do we want to think about this in a narrow way? I think we probably all agree we need to think about this in a broad way, and it's getting down to the details of how we structure the sort of the combination of those enablers. So from a next steps point of view, from the NBI perspective, we want to incorporate some final changes to electricity, petrochemicals, and mining analysis. I should point out that this is a work in progress, so you would have seen our disclaimers on each slide. We think we're pretty close to final outputs now, but there may be sort of tweaks as we learn from others, and we welcome engagement from all stakeholders in society, and I'm happy to adjust based on better knowledge. We're going to be launching our electricity findings towards the end of May, June, as well as bringing in that broader energy perspective on petrochemicals and gas. We're going to close out the socioeconomic modeling that I mentioned, and we're going to kick off analysis on a FALU. We've actually kicked that off already, but transport, construction, heavy manufacturing, and green finance. And there's a need at the end to have a module that kind of re-optimizes each individual sector. So for example, as we work through transport, we will note an increased demand for renewable energy to support electric vehicles, and that will require a reassessment of the electricity sector. And then hopefully prior to COP, publish many of these sector analyses, and then using COP, government hosts a South African pavilion at COP each year. We hope to support that and present this sort of enhanced ambition of both government and business to the international community, and position South Africa as an ultimate investment destination for zero and low carbon development. So that's the rush through of our work. I guess the invitation for commissioners and others, we're very happy to spend more time with you and present this over a longer period, but equally would really appreciate your input and your critique of what we're doing so that we can have a more usable and refined output. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Joanne, anything else from you?
I don't think so. I don't think so, Vali. I think the key thing, as Steve said, is that I suppose this is a collective business view of a set of possibilities. We would really like it to pull the work together. We'd like further input from key stakeholders. We're very happy to make it available to the Commission. We can't see if we've generated useful evidence, we think it should be used. So there is an offer to make that work available and to receive whatever input this collective would be able to bring in order to strengthen the work that we're doing. I think that our CEO champions are, in a sense, I think have walked the talk in terms of supporting a study that they believe and we believe could really assist quite fundamentally in moving corporate South Africa forwards in terms of what a just climate change transition is going to require. But I think that ensuring that we have been able to take into account the views of broader stakeholders is quite an important part of the work going forward. Maybe just one last thing to say is this work has happened as the funding for it has been able to be raised. We aren't entirely there. And so there are going to be certain gaps, and maybe those are gaps that can be taken up in other ways or through conversations in the way that the Commission, in fact, takes its work forward. But there are areas that I'm not certain that we're going to